All right, well, as we're waiting for some of our remaining guests to join us today, I'll start by introducing our program. And welcome everyone and glad to have you join us for this webinar. This is a webinar dealing with on-farm solar PV in the state of Maryland. And this is part of an ongoing webinar series that we will be carrying out through the rest of this year into December. And you'll see some of those additional sessions. Many of you have already joined upcoming sessions that we run these programs weekly. We'll start today running these programs on Wednesday at 1 o'clock. So please explore some of the other options if you haven't registered for some of the upcoming programs. But today, really diving in from a broad perspective of solar energy development in Maryland. And before we get into the topic, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Drew Chavon. I'm an energy extension specialist with the University of Maryland. And if you're not as familiar with extension as some of us may be, really extension in some sense, every state has one as part of their land grant university, but extension serves as a front door to the university in engaging with the public stakeholders in the state on a variety of issues. And of course, with my background in energy and my research dealing with energy technologies, energy conservation and efficiency, that's some of what we'll hit on today. And as part of our energy program with Extension, you'll see a number of other programs that we work with from residential and commercial. But of course, today we're gearing our talk more towards the agricultural options for solar PV. If you want to find out more information about some of our University of Maryland Extension programs dealing with energy, you can go on the website. That'd be the same website that you looked into this, that you registered for this program with. That's, excuse me, that's extension.umd.edu. And you can go to the energy section there and find out some more about the programming that we do. So, you know, I mentioned some of that being the front door to the university and having the benefit of delivering research-based information to the public. And I think this is particularly relevant for today's discussion of solar photovoltaics, because we're not approaching this webinar today or through this series from a sales pitch standpoint. You know, we're not trying to have folks on the line today implement solar PV or install that on their farm or on their house, rooftop, whatever it may be. This is more of a, let's learn about the challenges, let's learn about the opportunities, what are some of the distinctions that make solar PV stand out from some of the other options that you have to provide electricity and energy. And so we'll approach it from a really unbiased standpoint. So that's kind of what we'll look at today. Today being the first part of this series, we'll look at it from kind of a high level and again, just to see where Maryland stands with solar PV development, where it's headed, and we'll explore some of the options we have specifically related to agriculture here in the state and how we can implement that technology. So with that said, I'll kind of touch on some of the logistics here for Zoom. It's probably a technology that a lot of us are getting too comfortable with now. But how it'll run today, if you have some questions at any point, just put them into the chat feature and we'll leave some time at the end of our hour today to address some of those questions. I'll mention at this time as well, we're recording this. So recording will be put on the website for if you miss any of the important details or if you want to share this information with others, the recording will be available online. With that said, let me open a poll before we start on our conversation today. The poll should appear on your screens now. There's 2 questions, and this will give us an idea of what your interest level is and what your background is in this topic of solar photovoltaics. So if you look at the first question, you should see that question is basically what sector are you coming from. Hopefully we'll have a number of farmers join us on this program. If you're from research or government positions as well, we'd love to know that, just to know who we're connecting with, and we can gear our conversation towards that. So once you've addressed the first question, I think you may have to pull down on your menu there and you'll see question 2, specific technologies that you'd be interested in, whether it be for your home or for different farm applications. If an option, if you have something specific that you wanted to address, you could put it into the chat comment function there, and we'll take a look at that later. This is confidential. None of this information will be shared, just to help us guide our programming in today's webinar and subsequent sessions as well. So just one more minute to complete that poll and I'll close it. But also I'll say that your responses here help when we do more live in-person training events, which we'll be doing going into next year, into 2021. So, you know, looking at it from a broad perspective in today's webinar, then we can refine our scope in subsequent webinars and gear it towards what some of your interests and needs are. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thanks everyone for their input. So let's jump into the conversation for today. Again, this is a really wide perspective of the solar energy market in Maryland, and really start to understand and appreciate the differences between solar photovoltaics and some of the other energy options that we have available in the state from a generation and a end user standpoint. So to do that, I'll take a couple minutes here at the start just to address some of the fundamental forms of energy that we're talking about, define some of the terminology that we'll use, talk about the difference between renewable energy like solar PV would be included in, and we'll compare and contrast that to the conventional non-renewable resources. So a little bit of a science lesson to start. So just bear with me for several minutes, and hopefully we'll learn a bit from this. So to start the discussion, you know, we'll talk about, again, from a fundamental science standpoint, there's various forms of energy. Of course, with solar photovoltaics, we're talking about electricity. But there are a number of other forms of energy. You'll see those listed on the presentation. So whether it be a usable form like heat or light, you turn your light switch on, you'll have light energy there. And the important thing is, as we look at different energy sources, solar PV included, we'll see that we can go from one form of energy into another form of energy, typically one that's more useful for various applications in the farm or at home or whatever it may be. So I've included 2 examples here. One is the first example that you'll see is woody biomass. So if you have firewood, you can burn that firewood in a wood stove. It's a technology that many of us have here in the state of Maryland. You'll see more of them up north, but the idea with a wood stove, you're taking the chemical energy that's held inside of the wood and you're burning that to transform that into a usable heat form or energy form. In that case, it's heat. So that's one example of energy being transformed. A little bit different than what we're talking about with solar PV going to electricity, but it's one form of energy transformation. The other example is more in tune to what we're talking about with solar energy. So we have solar energy in the form of light, and in a natural setting, that plant absorbs the sunlight and it makes chemical energy. So what we're talking about with PV is a little bit different than that, but again, another example of light or some form of energy being transformed into another. Now, if you consider those 2 types of energy there, if you consider those 2 examples and couple those together, what you'll see is that really a lot of this energy originates from solar energy. And that would include solar photovoltaics. But look at these 2 systems together. The light energy from the sun gets absorbed into the plant, and then let's call it a tree, and then we're burning that firewood to produce heat. So what we'll see moving forward is a lot of energy does originate from the sun, and that would include the pathway we're talking about with solar photovoltaics. I'll say one more comment just about electricity, being that's the form of energy that we'll spend most of our time talking about today, and it's a really high quality form of energy in the sense that we can use electricity and convert that to many useful applications. So if you have electricity in your home, you can use that to produce heat, whether you have central HVAC or electric baseboards, you can use that electricity to heat your home. or heat any facility that you have. Likewise, you can use electricity and convert that into light. You turn the light switch on, you have light. So we'll really spend some time talking about that, not so much at a fundamental science level anymore, but just to give you that background in it. As I mentioned previously, here you'll see some different pathways that we can use solar energy. Okay, we've talked about that top route that you'll see, that photosynthesis process, if you remember from the previous example and from your science class growing up. That photosynthesis is where the plant gets its energy, and we can use that energy to create, or that plant material, we can capture that energy in the form of biofuels. So you'll see your ethanol blends at the gas station and things of that nature. But I'll draw your attention as well to the fact that fossil fuels, your conventional fuel sources like coal and natural gas, at least in some philosophical approach and theoretical approach, it really does originate from the sun, because those fossil fuels are fossilized remains of plant material. And so as over a significant amount of time, that decaying organic material turns into what we know as fuel sources like natural gas and coal and petroleum. But that's not really what we're going to talk about with solar photovoltaics. We'll talk about the direct use. If you follow that bottom pathway that I've shared on the presentation, we'll see how we can use that heat and the light directly for different applications. Now, when we're talking about solar photovoltaics, we're primarily talking about electricity generation starting with sunlight. And so we'll talk about that, but we'll mention from time to time a similar technology, what's known as solar thermal. Oftentimes these two technologies get confused a little bit. They can work in tandem, but they have some differences there. In solar thermal, you're heating a fluid, typically water, some kind of hot water application. But what we're talking about with solar photovoltaics is turning the light energy into electricity. So there are other energy sources that are common use in Maryland, things that don't come from the sun. It'd be like uranium that we use in Calvert Cliffs and nuclear power generation. There's some downsides to some of these technologies. There's tremendous benefits to them as well, but there are other energy sources besides just those ones originating from solar light and heat. Geothermal is another one. The picture there is indicating a geyser. Not that we have those in Maryland. We could use ground source heat pumps to capture that constant soil temperature, but there's a number of other technologies that we'll touch on through this discussion today. Now, I'm going to switch gears and talk to a little bit about how electricity is made, typically in a lot of different applications, whether you're talking about fossil fuel or renewables like wind. A lot of them use a turbine and generator system to produce electricity. And on a basic level, how those turbines work is something has to move that turbine and make it spin. As the turbine spins, it starts to generate electricity, and that's the function of the generator. So with the wind turbine, you can obviously see those blades of the turbine spinning around as the wind blows. With a dam or hydropower, you're going to have the water moving those turbines, and that's how a lot of operations work. A lot of electrical generation in the state of Maryland and in the country and around the world operate in these kind of turbine systems. A similar system is a steam generator. In this case, you're boiling a liquid. The vapor rises up, and the vapor, the steam, is what spins the turbine in that case. But that's how a lot of electricity is made today. Obviously, solar photovoltaic stands out as it's a very different technology. There's no turbine involved with solar PV. And so we'll kind of highlight the aspects of that some today and going into our program next week as well, if you're able to join us for that. But that's on a basic level how a lot of electricity is generated in the state. Now we'll talk about some of the other differences. There are obviously a lot of environmental differences between your conventional resources like nuclear and coal-powered generation. If you burn coal, for instance, you'll have greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions associated with it. Nuclear technology, you'll have the waste material, the nuclear waste to deal with. Solar photovoltaics does not have any of those emissions. And so that's one of the benefits and what makes it stand out in the marketplace today is it does have tremendous environmental benefits. And we'll talk about that from time to time and retouch on that topic as we move forward. But another aspect that I'll point to is that these conventional sources like nuclear power or coal-fired power plants, they are dispatchable. And what dispatchable means is that you can vary the production based on your needs. So if you think about it, if you've been asleep all night, when you wake up in the morning, you're going to turn the light switches on, you're going to start running motors and pumps and other functions. You're going to need more electricity as your day gets started. So with these dispatchable energy sources, you have the fuel, you have the capacity to increase your production to meet that demand. Even with woody biomass, assuming you have sustainable forest management in place and you have a steady stream of fuel resources for that energy, then yes, it's dispatchable. The difference here with technologies like solar photovoltaics and wind power is they're not dispatchable. Really, you're at the whim of natural resources. The wind needs to be blowing, or if you think at nighttime, or when you have cloudy environmental conditions that day, your solar PV is not going to be producing. So obviously you can work around that. You can develop battery integrated systems and other technologies to support that. But just in a very general basic sense, your solar PV as well as your wind, those are non-dispatchable. So there are some limitations to it, and we'll talk about how we can apply that on farm-based settings as we move forward. I'll make one note more about the difference between renewable and non-renewable energy sources at this point. The idea is, if you think about the non-renewables, things like coal and natural gas and petroleum, we only have so much of those resources at our disposal. There's only so many of those resources on the planet. And so you think about it theoretically, we'll start depleting those resources as we continue using energy. And so that's some of the difference there with renewables like solar PV, is that we can always be collecting that sunlight. If you draw your attention to the graphs, the data that I presented on the slide, and I don't want to get too, bogged down in numbers or anything. These are just rough estimates and projections on energy use going forward to the year 2050. But if you look in 2015, we were using about 18.5 terawatt years of energy. In 2050, we'll probably be using a lot more. And if you do the math on that, you'll see we're going to run out of coal and petroleum and natural gas and uranium and any of those other finite resources fairly soon. If you consider the renewables on the far right, with solar being at the top, you'll see we have a tremendous amount of resource at our disposal, and it's renewed each and every year. Not that we could feasibly capture all of that, but it still represents a very large, sustainable, renewing resource of energy that we can convert to practical applications. Now, I guess I can comment about the photos that you'll see on the left-hand side. On the top, you'll see an example of a solar thermal system. We're not going to really see these much outside of the southwestern United States. You have to have a lot of land space for that. And this is the solar thermal, again, is working with the heat from the sun, and that heat is what drives your turbine system that we mentioned previously. So we'll touch on that kind of technology from time to time, but mostly what we're talking about is solar to electricity, photovoltaics, and we'll break down what that means momentarily. But we'll see this on rooftops, we'll see it on ground-mounted systems, what we might call utility scale or solar farms. There's a lot of different applications for that. So that's what we'll spend most of our time discussing. Now, if we consider the definition of photovoltaic, it really, we can break it down with the word photo, meaning light, and voltaic is named after a scientist named Alessandro Volta. He was a pioneer in electricity. So if you look at that word, it literally implies that you're converting light into electricity, and that's exactly what I alluded to previously in those different forms of energy. That's the technology we're talking about, is generating electricity and then we can use that to meet any of our needs, residential needs, commercial, or agricultural needs using that electricity. So that's in a very general sense. And I won't bore you with the details of the history. I find it fascinating. You can find plenty more information online. But it's a technology that started back in the 1800s, but it wasn't until about the 1950s when it became a viable technology, when they invented the silicon cell. It's a technology material that's widely used in solar today. There are other technologies as well, but it was a very expensive technology back then, rarely used outside of space exploration. It was, I think, in the 1970s where more remote applications became available. So you would see it in places like railroad crossings and things where you did not have access to, an alternating current, an AC spot to plug your power into. We'll talk about a lot of farm applications as well, where that's very viable. You might not have grid power out on a remote site, and solar PV could be a good option for that still to this day. So that is some of the history there behind solar PV. We'll touch more on where we are today and where solar development's going in the state of Maryland specifically. I've got a note here to launch our second poll. So hopefully you're still awake and I haven't bored you with the background information here. I'm going to pull the second poll up. You should see that appear on your screen. The first question I'd ask you to respond to is giving us a more idea of why you're attending today. If you're interested in installing solar PV on your farm, or if you're helping someone else navigate this sector, I'd like to know that. So I'll give you a minute just to answer that first question. And once you've had time to do that, you can go down to the second question. Question number 2 is to please indicate your level of knowledge. Again, this is confidential, and I just want to understand going into this what your experience is and what your exposure is to solar PV. So I'll give you another minute to finish those questions. Okay, I'll go ahead and wrap the poll up here. And remember, at any point, if you have questions, please type those into the chat box and we'll address those when we wrap up at 2 o'clock. Okay, so we'll see where we are today. We'll jump forward a little bit. We've seen a lot of growth in solar PV industry. We'll start by looking at on a global level. So this is around the world, our pie chart that you'll see on your page here. For the most part, coal has dominated the electricity generation sector. It's been holding at 38% on a global level, followed by natural gas. And what you'll see in that pie chart is that renewables, and that is again the category that solar PV falls under, is a very small sector. It's growing, but it's very small on a global level. We'll start to refine smaller and smaller here by looking on the right-hand side. You'll see what's happening in the United States, and then we'll move on to Maryland a little bit later. But if you look at the US electricity generation, historically speaking, and I guess by historically, I mean within the last 20 years or so, again, coal has dominated. It was over 50% back in the early 2000s. It's declined and it's been surpassed by natural gas, that red line on the chart. You'll see it's been surpassed by natural gas, and for a variety of reasons. Natural gas prices are very affordable. It's very economical to connect in with natural gas, and it's a clean burning energy to some extent. So it does have its benefits. Coal power plants, to a large extent, they're aging. Many of them are being decommissioned and taken offline. So we are seeing a number of reasons why coal production in terms of electricity is declining. You'll see also on that chart on the right-hand side that nuclear power is remaining fairly constant in terms of the market share. Those nuclear power plants are pretty long-lasting and it's pretty stable production. But what you'll see towards the bottom of that graph is that, again, renewables play a smaller role in the sector, but they are growing. So we'll refine this a little bit. I've blown that section of the renewables up so you can see it a little bit better. The blue line is hydropower, your dams and things like that. That's staying fairly constant. But as I mentioned, renewables are beginning to climb. This green line for renewables includes things like wind power, both ground systems as well as offshore, and we're seeing a lot more of those come online in the coast. Biomass and other things would be included in that green line. But solar PV, I've separated that out, and you'll see solar PV down at the bottom. So again, a very small sector of the market in terms of electricity generation, and you'll see it start to grow exponentially there at about the year 2013. There were surely solar panels installed before 2013, but it really started to increase at 2013 for a number of reasons. The biggest of those being that utility scale generation started coming online. What I mean by utility scale is more in line with retail production of electricity, what we call solar farms, things like that, the larger systems where we get more accurate benchmarks and measurements on. So that's a big part of the growing sector, is the larger utility scale generation. I'll highlight some of the definitions that I use in referring to this. This is not set in stone. It's just common words that I use to describe some of the different sectors of solar PV. The first would be your small scale residential systems, and you could apply the same definition to agriculture. Again, the topic of our program today. But these are typically under 10 kilowatt systems. A lot of homes in the area have 6 to 9 kilowatt systems, but those are the smaller systems, either rooftop. You could do ground mounted as well, but that's about 20% of the market in the country. The commercial systems are typically up to about 5 megawatts. They may not be that large. It just depends on how big the system is. These are more common with Walmart, Amazon, IKEA, those companies that are taking more sustainable efforts, and typically these are up on their roof system. And then again, the largest scale ones, the utility scale operations, are about 5 megawatts or up. Now, Maryland Public Service Commission, the state, has some special permitting requirements for anything over 2 megawatts. So you might consider 2 megawatts to be utility scale to some extent. So again, these aren't hard and fast definitions. It's just how I'll kind of refer to some of these different types of projects moving forward. But what you'll see is those larger projects account for about 51% of the electricity generation nationwide. So it's quite a big and growing sector there. If we look at trends moving forward, what you'll see on the left-hand side is some projections going forward to the year 2050. And you'll see some of the similar trends that we've already seen at a national level. Coal generation is starting to decline. It's going from 24% down to 13%. So those conventional sources are being decommissioned for a number of reasons. We'll talk about those from time to time, but I want to draw your attention to the growth expected in renewables going from 19%, and this data comes from numbers that were reported last year in 2019. But renewables is expected to grow significantly over the next 20 or 30 years. In the center of the presentation, you'll see those renewables drawn out into different categories. And what you'll see is solar last year in 2019 was about 15% of electricity generation. That's moving forward to 46% by 2050. These numbers come out of a report put out by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA. If you want to read their report, it comes out every year. You can go on the website provided there. And I'll share some of this information on our website as well if you want access. Like I said, the video will be posted online, but you'll have access to some of these resources as well if you want to read more into this. But with that said, solar is expected to grow, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why. I want to pull up some data for Maryland, though, just to show that similar trends are taking place in the state of Maryland right now. And not to beat a dead horse here, but what you'll see is coal production, again, declining in the state of Maryland. You'll see nuclear going up a little bit from 2001 to 2019. It's a little early to get the data from 2020, and it's been kind of an odd year for energy as well as many other things. So we'll talk about some of that moving forward. But again, what you see is growing renewables. It's a very small part of our electricity generation, but it's definitely growing. So there's a couple factors or characteristics that really drive solar development in each state. And I've highlighted some of the factors that I think are important. Number one would be solar irradiance. So you have to have adequate sunlight. And what we see, I've pulled two different studies out here. You'll see a map on the left and right from two different studies, just kind of indicating two different approaches to looking at these factors. What you'll see is, California certainly has a lot of sun. States like Florida have a lot of sun, but Maryland is up there as well. We do have an abundant resource in terms of the sunlight. And we'll talk specifically about that probably next week. But just on a basic level, solar irradiance is pretty high in Maryland. Another factor, though, beyond just the resource availability is incentives and policies, whether that's at a federal or a state level. We'll see the importance of that to drive solar PV forward. And of course, from a end user standpoint, if I'm installing solar PV, I want to know what some of those incentives are in place and what some of the policies are to support that development if I'm investing in the technology. And then the third aspect is more economics, and that would be related to how expensive the electricity is. If your retail rates are pretty high, solar PV may be an option to reduce your expenses. And so we'll see some of those factors incorporated in these two studies. On the left-hand side, for instance, and I'll point out these two studies are more geared towards residential and rooftop systems. Our conversation today is not limited to rooftop systems, but these are two studies that are indicative of some of these driving factors like solar irradiance, incentives, and policies. And you see some of the states that have a lot of potential. States even like, if you look up in the Northeast, you'll see states like Maine and Vermont. They don't have a whole lot of sunlight, but their solar or their energy use in general, their use of electricity is pretty low, so they're able to support themselves with solar PV pretty well. Maryland is kind of in the middle there somewhat. We use quite a bit of electricity, and we're able to generate a significant amount of that. One difference that I'll point out between these two studies, if you look at the study put out by the SEPA on the right, you'll see Florida scores a little bit lower. And that's because the study on the right accounted for some of the incentives and policies, which in Florida's case, Florida has a lot of sunlight, but they don't have many incentives and policies in place to support that development. So we'll see the importance of that moving forward, is having historically incentives in place, but also moving forward some of the policies that push solar PV forward. So a number of countries have implemented at a federal or a national level, have implemented renewable policies, and those come in many shapes and sizes. But what we'll see is the United States does it more on a state level, but a lot of countries have implemented similar things to what some of the states in the United States have done. What you'll see is China, which has some pretty aggressive policies in place for renewable energy. And this is talking more than just solar PV, but other technologies as well. But arguably, a lot of the policies that have been put in place have driven solar PV forward. What you'll see is China on the right-hand side is really leading the way in implementing and installing solar photovoltaics. United States is up there as well. Germany's kind of hit their capacity, but they're still growing to some extent. But a lot of the policies are what drives this forward. There are other benefits as well, but this plays a big role in that. As I mentioned, we don't have a federal policy in place for renewable energy. We have state level mandates, and these are requirements for utilities to generate electricity from renewable resources. It's commonly called Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. Other states might have a little bit different naming for it, but this is what Maryland calls it, many other states. What you'll see if you can find Maryland on the map there is that we have, this goes back to 2019 session, we passed a law for 50% of electricity to come from renewables in the next 10 years. And so renewables, you know, it's a state-by-state definition, but renewables includes a lot of things like solar PV, wind, biomass, and other things. But like many other states, Maryland has also specifically targeted solar PV, and we have set a target in Maryland at 14.5% of electricity. And so if you are a generating facility and you are not meeting this requirement, then you'll be penalized. And so we'll see some of the outcomes that this has had long-term and short-term as well. But these are legal requirements, legal mandates within the state of Maryland. Now, this timeline is a history of this RPS in Maryland. I won't go through each and every law that was passed, but if you look back at the start in 2004, you'll see that we started with an ambitious at the time, goal of 3.5% of our electricity from renewables. And you fast forward, looking at last year, 2019, it went up to 50%. So it's had a lot of growth in the past 15, 16, 17 years, however long. It's had a lot of growth. We specifically, again, targeted solar at 14.5%. And there's some other stipulations in there that we have to supply energy from wind power as well. There's some other issues there, but that's in a general sense what's happened in the state of Maryland. This is just another way of looking at that to see our ambitions growing. We started pretty low, but we're at 50% renewables. There's a list of tier 1 renewables for the state of Maryland on the right. Again, every state might define this a little bit different, but these are the resources that we prioritize. Solar is included there. And again, solar has specifically been carved out at 14.5%. So we'll see growth in that way. And I'll add to it that once we reach that 50% goal, the state of Maryland has ambitions to increase to 100%. And you'll see a number of states taking that approach as well, as increasing and increasing over time. One of the interesting aspects that comes out of this RPS is it really pushes this renewable energy credit market forward. And if you're not familiar with what a renewable energy credit is, we'll kind of take a minute here to explain that. Renewable energy credit is in reference to any renewable energy, but specifically the solar renewable energy credit, SREC. That is a proof of compliance that some electricity has been generated from in the case of an SREC, from solar PV. And so this happens, it's a tradable certificate or proof that electricity came from solar PV. It's a transaction that happens separate from the actual energy being transferred. So if you have solar PV installed on your property, you own the equipment, and you're producing electricity, it's an extra added revenue stream that you can sell that certificate to someone that may not be in compliance with their RPS. Whether it's in the state of Maryland or outside the state of Maryland, you can sell that SREC, and it's again an added revenue stream. So it drives that market. Every time this state mandate, the RPS is bumped up one. So if you look back in the chart, 2019, well, it doesn't go that far. But if this chart did go up until 2019, you would see the SREC market definitely jumped up much higher than it is presented in this chart, because we jumped up to 50% renewable energy and 14.5% solar. So it's driven this market forward a lot. So there's that incentive side that's been beneficial to solar development in the state as well. Now, if you look at some of the challenges with it is historically speaking, a lot of those SRECs or just your traditional renewable energy credits, they've been purchased from out-of-state production. And so what I mean by that is there's been electricity generated from other states, and we're buying their certificates to meet our RPS. So it's kind of been contradictory there. Maryland's not benefiting directly from the employment opportunities and the direct local environmental benefits of technologies like solar PV. But to meet our RPS, that's happened quite a bit in the past, is folks buying those certificates from outside the state. So the SREC pricing there on the right-hand side, I pulled that this week. What you'll see is Maryland's at $79 per credit or megawatt hour. So we've seen some growth. We were much lower 2 years ago before that RPS was bumped up. But you'll see some of the neighboring states there either higher or lower. So there's some trade-off on where you're buying your credits from. A number of other policies have been supportive of solar PV in the state of Maryland and regionally. I will not spend time addressing each and every one of these, but I'll just mention them in passing. Things like the greenhouse gas reduction plan that was put in place by the previous administration. There's the regional and multi-state programs, RGGI and the TCI, targeting greenhouse gas emissions from power plants and transportation respectively. All those initiatives have been to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. And while not specifically prioritizing solar PV has been pushed forward quite a bit by some of these policies. There's other policies that even at a local level, like the Baltimore Clean Air Act and other things like that, that have really supported solar PV development in the state, because again, solar PV doesn't release any of those emissions like traditional fuels do. One other aspect, from an economic or incentive standpoint that has been beneficial to solar PV development, and this net metering concept is one that will come up many times in our program. We'll talk about it more later this season as we address some of the more economic aspects of solar PV. But net metering is a mandate in the state, like a lot of states have implemented. And just on a basic level, how it works is the meter on your site, whether it be your home or your farm, whatever it is, that meter allows electricity to flow both ways. So if you're producing electricity from your solar PV, that gets sent to the grid, and at nighttime, for instance, you can pull that electricity back from the grid to use, because your PV is not going to be working at night. So again, it goes both ways, and depends on how you're set up with your utility provider, but they'll settle the bill at the end of the month or the end of the year. And if they owe you any money or credit to your account, then that'll happen in that way. So that's again been very beneficial. And there's some limitations to how much energy can flow onto the grid, but we can touch on that another time, or if there's questions on it. On a federal level, the investment tax credit, historically it's been pretty good driver of solar PV development. So if you buy if you own the PV system, you can take advantage of the tax credit. Right now it's 26%. For a long time it was at 30. It's dropping down, and within 3 years it'll be phased out for residential clients. It'll still be there for commercial operations and farm operations, but I would say that's been a big driver as well. There's some state programs as well. The Maryland Energy Administration has one for storage. So if you have a storage system like a battery system, you can take advantage of some of the finances there from the tax incentives and apply that to a battery system. We'll touch on some of the economics here. I know I'm kind of getting low on time, so we won't be able to get into as much detail if we have time for questions at the end, but I'll say the economics are working out in favor of solar PV. If you look at the price going back 20 years, it was much higher than what it is today. We're approaching about $1 per watt, give or take a little. It's a little bit different if you're considering the larger utility scale systems. Just with those big utility scale systems, you have the benefit of economies of scale. And the residential systems, the smaller farm-based systems, if it's a really small system, It's a little bit higher, but it's approaching $1 per watt, give or take. Also, if you'll look at the right-hand side, there's some information there I'm sharing about the levelized cost, and what the levelized cost is. You know, that takes into account the cost of operation and maintenance of your system, as well as the fuel cost. So if you consider a conventional energy resource like coal, those operating facilities, it requires a lot of input, a lot of maintenance, a lot of money to keep it operating and maintained. You have to pay for the resource itself, in that case, coal. So you have to pay quite a bit to keep that system running, whereas solar photovoltaics, there's very little maintenance and very little operation. You save quite a bit there. Obviously, solar PV has quite of an upfront investment attached to it, but look at the solar sunlight being a free resource that you don't pay for. Has its benefits. And if you consider the lifetime of a solar PV system, it starts to become much more comparable to your conventional things like coal power, especially nuclear and other energy generation. So it does have its benefits there, and especially once you get that investment capital paid off for investing in the equipment itself. All of these different factors have played together. The policies, the economics have played together to support that. We've seen an increased production of solar PV panels. We've seen the efficiency of the panels increase. The raw material prices go down. So it's becoming much more viable technology. On a national level, you'll see here, again, that those bars, year after year, you'll see utility scale growing significantly, as well as residential and commercial. But there's been a lot of growth and expected to grow despite some impacts from this year's pandemic. There's some loss in employment in the solar PV sector, people going on furlough and other things. But you know, we'll have to see how it comes out. But if things go according to expectations, the industry will shift back and recover fairly quickly. Here's a closer look at what's happening in Maryland. You'll see a lot of growth in the residential sector. So Maryland has quite a bit of residential, those smaller scale systems, as well as utility scale and commercial, but especially a lot of residential smaller scale systems. 2020, it's a little early to see what's happening from that just yet, but there's still, even with COVID situation, there's been quite a growth in this calendar year. If you are interested in specific projects in your area of the state, you can use the SEIA map. I'll include some of this information on the website as well. If you want to go in and navigate, you can explore the map and find out about various projects in the area. It's not going to give you information on, you know, your neighbor's rooftop system, but you'll get an idea some of the bigger projects are going on around you. Here's a bit of information on where Maryland stacks up compared to other states. We've currently got, if you look at the line item for Maryland, you'll see we've got over 1,200 megawatts currently installed, and quite a bit of installations, over 70,000 installations in the state of Maryland. If you look at a neighboring state like Virginia, the next line item, Virginia, is about the same, 1,100 megawatts, but only 12,000 installations. So what this indicates is, again, Maryland has quite a bit of residential small-scale systems in place. We are growing in utility scale. You'll see a number of those utility scale projects coming online in Maryland. So it's growing. There's a lot of legal and policy issues associated with it. We'll spend, you know, special attention given to some of those larger scales as we go through, you know, in subsequent weeks of this seminar, of this webinar series. But just to give you an idea of where we are. Again, recapping some of the trends in Maryland, this just same information we've kind of alluded to previously, but if you look right there at the center, you'll have the number where we are currently. We are at a little over 4% of our electricity right now coming from solar PV. Our RPS has been increased to 14.5. So we still got a ways to go to reach that goal. Now, I know, again, I'm short on time, so I'll kind of highlight some of the aspects of different farm applications now, as we get a more refined vision for where this webinar series is going. We'll talk about some of the technology, some of the options that you have for implementing it on a farm. So I'll quickly touch on some of that now. There's a number of different options available. Your typical structural addition would be putting it on a rooftop of your house or a barn or poultry housing, whatever it may be. So this would obviously require that you have a good roof and an existing structure. You could have building integrated PV. We're not going to spend much time talking about this because it's more commercial projects. In the BIPV, building integrated PV, it's solar technology, innovative technology that's kind of a part of the structure. We'll talk a little bit about solar shingles and things like that that are an option. A lot of folks in the state have expressed interest in that, so we'll touch on that, but we're not going to see that too much on farms around the state, probably for the foreseeable future. Ground-mounted systems are typically your larger systems, but farms have a lot of that resource available. Most farms in the state have the land to go with that, or if you don't have a building or a good roof system to support solar PV, ground-mounted might be the way to go. The options on the right-hand side are your smaller, typically battery backup systems. Micro solar is what I refer to as those small, typically consumer systems, and those are usually for like camping or hiking or activities like that. But what we see on more farm settings is mobile solar systems. So with a mobile solar system, you could mount your system on a trailer and move it from one site to another, whether that be for livestock watering or some application like that where you may need to move the system from one site to another. Or you could have your stationary pole-mounted systems for electric fencing, pumping from a well, or something like that where it's not going to move. So those are some of the options, and we'll explore those in detail moving forward next week and in subsequent webinars. But I'll just make a quick comment here about differences. You have to weigh the costs and benefits and applications, whether you're going to be on the grid, grid tied, or you're going to be off the grid. With off grid, you typically have a battery to back yourself up. So at nighttime, that battery will supply the energy that you need. Where the grid tied system, you're tied to the utility grid, and that's where you get your energy in off periods. So one key thing that I'll point out about that, and there's usually some confusion about this, is when you have a power outage, if they're doing maintenance on the line or a big storm event and your power goes out at the utility level, I just want to emphasize that if you're grid tied, your solar PV system will shut down as well. So you're not only going to lose your utility power, but as well as your solar PV system, and that's for safety reasons. The power is required to be shut down so you're not feeding power back onto the grid, which could be a safety issue. So I just wanted to point that out. We'll talk about it more as we move forward. There are a number of reasons to implement solar PV on a farm, and those of you out there that are interested in it have an idea of what your interest is, but I'll highlight some of those now. From an economic standpoint, it can be a good tool to lower your electricity rates. And it's not across the board. I'm not going to say that it always pans out economically. We'll talk about the importance of planning and design work and some of those factors that have to be accounted for so that you can make sure that it's a good economic decision to make. But from a marketing standpoint, an environmental standpoint, whatever it may be, it's a very sustainable option to go with. And one I haven't mentioned too much is the backup power aspect of it, being able to avoid disruptions in the power, especially if you have a backup system like a battery to complement that. But it's very good from a resiliency standpoint. There's some other pros and cons. I'm not going to touch too much more on those because I want to make sure we have time for questions before we sign off here. But before I open it up for questions, go ahead and continue to add those questions to the chat feature. And as you do that, I'll kind of highlight some of the upcoming programs that we have. Again, these are listed on our website. Many of you have already registered for those upcoming webinars. But starting next week on Wednesday, we'll talk about the basics of solar PV, looking at different components, how those components are connected, and get into more specifics on that. We'll talk about other issues later this season, October, November, and into December, dealing with different issues. So if you want to find more information, go to our website. It's provided there, extensionumd.edu/energy.